All right, diving right in today. We've got a pretty fascinating set of sources you sent us. Two transcripts from news outlets, and they're covering former President Trump's recent address to Congress. Seems like you're interested in getting a feel for where things stand politically these days, and maybe uncover some of the, well, let's just say more colorful elements of this speech, huh?
Yeah, it's always interesting to analyze these sorts of speeches, especially from someone as polarizing as Donald Trump, right? I mean, there's just so much we can learn about his strategies, what he's prioritizing, even how he tailors his message to appeal to specific groups.
Okay, so let's just jump right in and unpack this thing. These transcripts, they really paint a picture, don't they? I mean, standing ovations, heckling, even an ejection from the chamber.
It's true. They capture not just what he said, but how people reacted. Gives us a glimpse into the current political climate and how divided Congress really is.
Absolutely. And right off the bat, Trump emphasizes his victory in the recent election. He highlights winning all 7 swing states, taking both the popular vote and the majority of counties. This whole red wave imagery, like a dominant Republican victory sweeping the nation. Why do you think he chose to start with that?
Well, it's strategic, especially with all the controversies surrounding his previous elections still lingering. By hammering home the scale of his win, he's trying to solidify his legitimacy, and bolster his agenda, almost like he's laying the groundwork to claim this powerful mandate from the people.
Interesting. And then he immediately jumps into this whirlwind of actions taken during his first 43 days. We see a bunch of executive orders, declarations of national emergencies, troops deployed to the southern border. It feels like a rapid-fire list of achievements, almost like a highlight reel, showcasing his decisive leadership style.
And it's interesting what he chooses to highlight, isn't it? Immigration, government efficiency, deregulation, things that are going to resonate with his core supporters right out of the gate.
Yeah. Then he turns his attention to the Democrats. He accuses them of, and I'm quoting here, refusing to celebrate American wins. He even suggests that their unhappiness is all because they lost the election. It's a pretty direct challenge.
It is. That's classic Trump. He's framing the opposition as obstructionist, unpatriotic even, the us versus them rhetoric. It's something we've seen time and again. And it's effective. It really solidifies that divide between the parties and energizes his base, gives them a clear enemy,
Right. And speaking of rallying against something, he spends a considerable amount of time going after, as he puts it, wokeness. He talks about banning DEI initiatives, making English the official language, even renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Are these just random examples, or do you think there's a strategy behind them?
Oh, they're carefully chosen, for sure. They play into very specific anxieties about cultural change, about traditional values being threatened. It taps into the fears of people who feel like their way of life is under attack, which, again, ties right back into that focus on reclaiming national identity and strength. That resonates deeply with his base.
Absolutely. Okay, so next up, we're going to take a bit of a roller coaster ride through Trump's economic agenda. Get ready, because he talks about imposing tariffs on countries like China and India, even Canada and Mexico. He claims they've been taking advantage of the U.S. for decades with unfair trade practices. What kind of impact could this approach have?
Well, tariffs are a bit of a double-edged sword, aren't they? They can be beneficial to certain industries and workers, but they can also backfire and lead to higher costs for everyone else.
So it's not as simple as saying tariffs are good or tariffs are bad.
No, not at all. The economic and political ramifications are complex. They really need to be watched closely. I mean, economists have been debating this for decades.
Right. Then he pivots to tax cuts. He promises relief for working families, wants to eliminate taxes on tips and overtime pay, even make car loan interest deductible. But only for American-made cars. I'm sensing a theme here. What's behind this emphasis on American-made products?
This is what you'd call economic populism, right? Championing policies that directly benefit blue-collar workers, pushing American manufacturing. It all plays into that America First philosophy and solidifies his support among a very specific demographic.
Makes sense. And just when you think you've heard it all, he throws out some pretty startling figures about government waste. Claims to have uncovered billions in fraudulent spending on things like, and I'm not making this up, transgender mice and vegan climate action in Zambia.
Well, nobody likes to see their tax dollars wasted, do they? So highlighting that is always a good tactic. But it's important to examine these examples. Are they accurate? Are they representative of actual widespread waste, or are they just meant to provoke a reaction?
Right. Good point. It's definitely something for our listener to consider. Always double-check those facts and draw your own conclusions.
Exactly. It's fascinating how he blends these policy pronouncements with this emotionally charged language and those anecdotes. It's potent, that's for sure. It resonates with his supporters, and it might even sway some undecided voters.
Okay, so we're back, and we're digging deeper into this address from former President Trump. And this time, we're tackling one of the most, well, let's just say it, contentious issues out there right now, right? Immigration and border security.
Yeah, you can tell just from these transcripts that it's still a core issue for him and for his base.
No doubt. He doesn't hold back either. He calls the situation at the border an invasion and praises that huge drop in illegal crossings that happened during his last term. And then he goes on to tell these really intense stories of American citizens who were victims of crimes committed by illegal immigrants. What do you make of that approach?
It's powerful stuff, right? He's using strong language. He's personalizing the issue with these emotional anecdotes. And it appeals directly to the fears and anxieties of his supporters. It's a strategy that's worked for him before, creates a sense of urgency, justifies his call for tougher border control, stricter immigration policies.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there. He also mentions wanting to rename a national wildlife refuge after a 12-year-old girl who was murdered. And he claims the people responsible were illegal immigrants released by the Biden administration. He even calls for MS-13 and Mexican drug cartels to be labeled as terrorist organizations. I mean, these moves seem symbolic, but do they actually have any real-world impact?
Oh, they do. Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely that symbolic element, for sure. But there are practical consequences as well. He's linking his policies directly to victims of crime, framing these groups as terrorists. It's all about demonizing them, building support for his hardline stance. It's like he's saying, look, if you're against these policies, you're siding with criminals and terrorists.
It's a strong message for sure. And this idea of good versus evil, right versus wrong, it carries over into how he talks about woke ideology. He targets this huge range of things, DEI initiatives, transgender rights, you name it. You mentioned earlier that wokeness is kind of a vague term. Can you unpack that a little bit for our listeners?
Yeah. Wokeness has basically become this catch-all term, right? Conservatives use it to criticize what they see as an excessive focus on social justice, political correctness. It's often used to dismiss these concerns about racism, sexism, those sorts of things, like they're being too sensitive, or even that it's harmful to society.
So when Trump rails against wokeness, he's really tapping into this anxiety that people have, like traditional values and ways of life are under attack.
Exactly. It's like this longing for a simpler time when these issues weren't so front and center. It's that whole Make America Great Again sentiment, back when things were supposedly better.
Right. And he really hones in on DEI initiatives. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion. These programs that are meant to promote representation, equal opportunities for groups that have historically been marginalized. Yeah. Why do you think he chose to focus on this specifically?
It plays right into the fears of people who feel like DEI is actually discriminatory against white people.
Yeah.
Or that it's promoting, reverse racism. There's this resentment there, this feeling that the system is rigged against them.
Interesting. He also calls for making English the official language of the U.S., which, that's a theme that pops up pretty often in nativist movements, right? Yeah. Tied to this fear of cultural change and immigrants not assimilating. Is that even a realistic proposal?
Well, it might appeal to people who see a unified national identity as being tied to a single language. But you have to remember, the U.S. has always been multilingual, and this kind of proposal could be seen as exclusionary. It might have these unintended consequences for immigrants, for people who speak other languages.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue for sure. And then there's this move that caught a lot of people off guard. He announces his intention to rename Mount McKinley back to its original Native Alaskan name, Denali.
Yeah.
What's the significance there, beyond just changing the name of a mountain?
It's symbolic, that's for sure. By restoring that Native Alaskan name, he's trying to appeal to this sense of history and tradition, potentially garnering support from people who feel like American culture is being eroded by progressive values.
Fascinating. And then he makes this statement declaring that there are only two genders, male and female, which is, clearly aimed at invalidating the experiences of transgender and non-binary individuals.
Right, and that reflects a belief held by a certain segment of the population that gender is binary and it can't be changed. It fits with a conservative worldview that rejects gender fluidity, sees those traditional gender roles as really essential to the social order.
And his attacks on wokeness continue as he goes after critical race theory. that framework for understanding how racism is baked into our institutions and systems, right? He wants removed from public schools, says it teaches kids to hate America, promotes division. What are the implications of that?
Well, critical race theory has really become this lightning rod for conservatives. They see it as this attack on American values, like they're trying to indoctrinate kids with a radical ideology. And by framing it as unpatriotic and divisive, Trump is tapping into the fears of parents who don't want their kids being taught a quote-unquote distorted view of history.
It's interesting how he's connecting these cultural issues to education, something that's so sensitive for so many parents.
Right, and it's effective.
Yeah.
Because he's positioning himself as this defender of traditional values, a protector of children. It's a core concern for a lot of voters, and he's framing himself as their champion.
And he keeps pushing, even wading into this debate over transgender athletes in women's sports. He wants to ban men from competing in women's sports, argues that it creates this unfair advantage and undermines the integrity of women's athletics. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, this is a tough one. There are really strong opinions on both sides. You have concerns about fairness, about the level playing field, but you also have these concerns about discrimination and the right of transgender individuals to participate in sports in a way that aligns with their gender identity.
And he even shares this pretty graphic story about a high school volleyball player who was seriously injured after being hit by a ball spiked by a transgender opponent. What do you think he's trying to do with that?
It's about evoking that visceral reaction, making the issue feel personal and relatable, even if the story itself, well, maybe it lacks some important context.
So it seems like he's using fear, outrage, these appeals to traditional values to rally his base and push back against what he calls this woke agenda.
That's a good way to put it. It's about creating that division, that us versus them. He's positioning himself as the champion of the people who feel like they've been left behind.
Interesting stuff. And in our final segment, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to look at Trump's economic proposals, tariffs, tax cuts, even those allegations of government waste. I'm going to break it all down for you, so stay tuned. And we're back for our final deep dive into this speech from former President Trump. We've covered a lot of ground already, but now it's time to tackle those economic proposals. You sent us these transcripts because you really wanted to get a handle on his current messaging. And man, did he have a lot to say about the economy.
Yeah, he really did. I mean, it was a major focus of this address. Tariffs, taxes, government spending, even the national debt, he touched on it all.
Okay, so let's start with those tariffs. He's still convinced that countries like China and India, even our neighbors Canada and Mexico, have been taking advantage of the U.S. for decades. And he wants to hit them with these reciprocal tariffs, basically matching their tariffs unless they start playing by what he considers fair trade rules. Now, you explained earlier that tariffs are basically taxes on imported goods. But for our listener who's maybe not an economist, can you really break down what kind of impact this could have?
Sure. Let's say you own a small business and you need to import parts to make your products. Suddenly, those parts become more expensive because of tariffs. Well, you're probably going to have to raise your prices, right? Just to stay afloat. And that means consumers end up paying more for everyday goods. That can lead to inflation. But on the flip side, tariffs can also protect domestic industries from that foreign competition, and that could lead to more jobs here in the U.S.
Okay, so it's complicated. There are potential winners and losers. It's not as simple as saying tariffs are good or tariffs are bad.
Exactly. It's a balancing act, really. And the long-term consequences, well, those are hard to predict.
I hear you. And then he switches gears, right? Talks about tax cuts, promises relief for those working families who are really feeling that inflation pinch, wants to eliminate taxes on things like tips and overtime pay, even make car loan interest deductible. But, and there's always a but with him, isn't there? Only for American-made vehicles. He's really playing to those blue-collar workers, isn't he?
Absolutely. It's that classic economic populism, really target those policies that benefit blue-collar workers directly, boost American manufacturing. It's all about that America First message and shoring up support among a specific demographic.
It's a strategy, for sure. But some critics argue that these kinds of tax cuts mostly benefit the wealthy, not working families. Is there any truth to that?
Well, tax policy is a thorny area. There's a ton of debate about who really benefits. Some studies say that tax cuts actually stimulate economic growth, and that leads to more jobs, higher wages for everyone. But other studies show that those benefits go mostly to the higher earners. Minimal impact on those lower income households. It's a tough one to parse, really.
Yeah, there are no easy answers there. And then He drops this bombshell, right? Claims he's found billions of dollars in fraudulent government spending. And the examples he gives are almost unbelievable. Things like transgender mice and, get this, vegan climate action in Zambia.
I mean, you gotta admit, it's a classic tactic. Highlight that wasteful spending, play on that frustration people have with government. It makes it seem like taxpayer money is just being thrown away on these frivolous projects.
Yeah.
But, and it's a big but, you gotta be careful about taking these claims at face value. Oftentimes, those examples, well, they're taken out of context or they're missing some key details. You really have to dig deeper.
So it's a bit of a buyer beware situation. You can't always believe what you hear, especially during a political speech.
Exactly. Be a critical thinker, especially when it comes to these inflammatory claims.
Right. Good advice. And then he gets into Social Security, which is always a hot topic, right? He claims that millions of dollars are being paid out to people who are over 100 years old. Some even listed as over 200. I mean, it just seems like he's trying to create fear and distrust around a program that a lot of seniors rely on.
And it's understandable why people would be worried, right? Social Security is this lifeline for so many Americans. Any hint of fraud or mismanagement is going to cause anxiety. But we got to remember, these claims, as scary as they sound, need to be checked out, verified. We can't just jump to conclusions or spread misinformation based on allegations that might not even be true.
That's a good point. And then he wraps things up with this really bold proposal, a gold card program. And this would essentially let wealthy foreign investors buy their way into U.S. citizenship for a cool $5 million.
Yeah.
He says the money would go towards reducing the national debt. What do you think about that?
It's definitely controversial. On the one hand, it could be a way to attract foreign investment, maybe even chip away at that deficit. But on the other hand, it raises some ethical questions, doesn't it? It suggests that citizenship is something that can be bought, that the wealthy get special treatment. It's definitely going to spark some debate.
No doubt. Well, as we come to the end of our deep dive into former President Trump's address to Congress, it seems like he's using a lot of those familiar tactics.
Yeah.
He's tapping into those economic anxieties, playing on those cultural grievances. He's really trying to paint himself as the champion of the everyday American.
And you can't deny he's really good at connecting with that segment of the population, the people who feel like they've been left behind, that no one's listening to them. But whether his solutions are realistic, whether they'll actually help in the long run, well, that's another question entirely.
That's the big question, isn't it? Well, this has been a fascinating look at the political landscape and the challenges we're facing as a country. And, it's a reminder that we have to be engaged, to think critically, and to really seek out different perspectives before we form our own opinions.
And maybe even more importantly, it reminds us to be wary of those simple solutions because the problems we're facing, they're complex. They require real thought, a willingness to compromise, to find that common ground.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We hope you've gained some new insights into former President Trump's message and maybe a better understanding of just how complex these issues really are. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep that conversation going.